what she found most surprising when she was doing her research. You've been around the world, we've crossed paths so many times. What surprised you the most about this particular story?
Well, I think it was, I didn't really know about Libya before I went in, and I was just blown away by the people. They were so enthusiastic, they were so determined, and they were so funny. And I realized you had this strange situation where you had this man, Gaddafi. He was like a toad. He'd been sitting on the top of this country for 42 years without moving or changing. And yet these people were so alive.
Tell me about Gaddafi, because you've met him, I've met him. He seems so crazy. Was he?
I think in the end he was crazy. I think it was a classic example of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think he was crazy necessarily when he first came to power in 1969. And as I chronicle in the book, he was greeted with huge enthusiasm. I met many people who loved him. One of the people in the book, Mukhtar, talks about how as a kid he saw Gaddafi as a rock star. He thought that he was the most fantastic thing ever, how he won a prize at school, which was a flight on an aeroplane, because he'd written an essay about how great Gaddafi was. But as time went on, Gaddafi had these idiosyncratic ideas about how the country should be ruled. He saw himself as a philosopher king, and some of his ideas were nuts.
I remember interviewing him where he said, you know, not long before he fell, that my people love me so much, they will die to protect me. That kind of delusion, what effect did it have on the people who you talked to who were then rising up against him?
I think Libyans had a sense both of humiliation as well as fear. Of course, the main thing was fear, because this was a brutal government. But also, they felt embarrassed that this man, Gaddafi, this crazy guy in the robes with the Botoxed face, that he was the one who represented them.
And you do talk about this terrible prison massacre that took place in the late 90s, Abu Salim prison. My question to you then is, was it Tunisia and Egypt that really prompted the Libyans to rise up and say, well, if they can do it, we can do it? Or was there an even deeper reason for them to want to go after Gaddafi?
It was both. I had never heard of the Abu Salim massacre before I went. And then I went to meet some of the families. And there was one little old man. He came up to tell me his story. He told me how his brother-in-law had been kept in this terrible prison, and that he had taken, every 2 months, he had gone up to Tripoli and taken food and clothing. And that he said, I did that for 14 years, leaving the stuff at the gate, before they told me he was dead. Because his brother-in-law had been one of the 1,270 men massacred in cold blood in Abu Salim prison in 1996. Now, people don't forget things like that. People don't forgive with things like that.
And that massacre
yes.
was a Gaddafi and his interior yes. minister, the fabled and hated Zanussi.
Yes, his brother-in-law.
A show of strength.
We still don't know why did they do it. Because these were prisoners, political prisoners, mainly Islamists, who had rioted because their conditions were so terrible in the prison. Many of them were dying of TB. And the prisoners thought they had done a deal to get better conditions, but then they herded them into this courtyard, put the soldiers around the roofs and gunned them down. One of the people I speak to in the book, who was an eyewitness in another cell, talked of how he saw the walls of the courtyard turn red.
Let me talk about how it's not easy also to cover these conflicts. I mean, you and I have been around, but this last year was terrible for our brotherhood and sisterhood. In Libya, we lost Tim Hetherington, we lost Chris Hondros, we lost Anton Hemmel, all photographers. How difficult and scary was covering Libya?
Well, I was mainly in the east, on the Eastern Front, and it was very scary at times because it was kind of wild. Sometimes we're a danger to ourselves as journalists because we need to be told you can only go this far and no further, because we will go as far as you can go.
It's the only way to do it, though.
And that's right, but it meant that we could get right up to the front line and even cross the front line. And it was hard sometimes to tell where the front line was. And then shells would come in, and then there was also the craziness, because these guys, the rebel army, they were forever firing into the air. What goes up must come down. People were being injured because of that. So it was a pretty chaotic situation. Misurata was the most dangerous place. That was the city which was under siege, and the journalists who we lost, 2 of them were killed there. because it was being shelled the whole time. So yeah, it was a very dangerous situation, but I think that we felt compelled to cover this story because this was one of the most extraordinary and exciting stories of our time. This was history happening before our very eyes. I didn't want to be anywhere but Libya.
You were in Misurata when Gaddafi's body was finally brought there after he'd been killed. What was that scene like?
It was extraordinary. Gaddafi's death was savage. He was pulled limb from limb. And then they put his body in a sort of meat storage facility. And I think it was very gruesome, but for Libyans it was really important. They went through one by one and people filmed this body on their smartphones. Now for that, I look at that and go, ooh. But you know, they needed to know he was dead. It was somehow very important. I met the guys who had captured him. They said they weren't the ones who killed him. I'm not sure about that. And they had taken off him some of the paraphernalia, his boots with the Cuban heels, a little amulet, African good luck charm.
What's a Cuban heel?
A Cuban heel is like 1.5 inches. He wanted to be taller than he was. Even
he was already tall.
But he even said he wanted to be taller. He wanted to be bigger than anybody. And his golden pistol, which I actually got to handle. He had this golden pistol with a fleur-de-lis pattern on it, which was just extraordinary. But you know, he still had this hold over people. In the book, I have the story of a young woman whose father was murdered by Gaddafi's people in London. And when she found his body, she found him lying in a pool of blood, and he had meat skewers through his face. She went to see Gaddafi's body, and I asked her how she felt, and she said, you know, I looked at him and I thought, he's so small. He's just a man. And then she began to cry, and she said, you know, the last time I saw a body like that was when I saw my father's body.
And it's incredibly difficult to cover what's going on in Syria right now.
Yeah.
And we've lost friends there. We've lost Marie. We've lost Remy Oshlik and Anthony Shadid, and I'm going to cry. Ah!
Yep. It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. I mean...
How does one summon the strength and the passion to keep going and doing this? And what did Marie tell you, her last encounter with you when she was going from Beirut?
Marie, okay, I had dinner in Beirut with Marie before she sneaked over the border into Homs, into Syria. And I said I couldn't go. It was beyond my danger threshold. I couldn't do it. But she said, anyway, it's what we do. And then I spoke to her on Skype just a few hours before she was killed by a shell that came into where she was staying. And she said, Lindsay, this is the worst we've ever seen. And she felt very passionately that story of what was happening, the killing of civilians, of women, of children by the regime in Syria, it had to be told, and that it was incredibly important that she should be there as an eyewitness. And I agree with her, but she was my friend and she paid with her life.
Well, I hope that people are listening, and I hope the paralyzed political reality that we're living and watching right now is somehow galvanized by all those eyewitness reports that she sent out and that others are sending out now from Syria.
Well, so do I, although I don't think it's simple, but I can't believe that there's nothing that can be done. There has to be a much stronger, at least a much stronger diplomatic push and much more work with the Russians because children are being massacred. Children are being massacred and we're sitting here.
Muammar Gaddafi came to power when he was only 27. Impressive, but Britain's William Hague began his meteoric career when he was a lad of 16. From prodigy to political powerhouse, when we come back.
We keep challenging